What's going on, everybody? Hey, welcome to the E21NextGen podcast. My name's Augustine, and I'm excited to be hosting the conversation today. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There's episodes coming out weekly, and we want you to have a space where you can be encouraged and equipped as a next-gen leader. But today I have a very special guest with us, a guest really for the podcast, but someone who's been a part of next-gen E21 for a while now, and that is Kerri Persaud. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on here, Kerri.
Thank you, Augustine. It's great to be here with you and having a conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. You've got some amazing content that I want to get us into here in just a second that I think will be really empowering and encouraging for next-gen leaders. So whether you're in kids ministry, youth, young adult, nonprofit world, you have something valuable that you can get out of today's episode. But I want to start with a little bit of a backdrop. So would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit about who you are? Where are you located in the world? We love to show off everyone that is around the world. And also, what is this project that I've been kind of alluding to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am located in Canada. I live in Brampton, which is just outside of Toronto. We're a kind of a bedroom community. I have lived in Canada my entire life. But I grew up on the East Coast. So I grew up in New Brunswick, just up the coast from Maine. And so I love the coast, love the ocean, but relocated just over 25 years ago to the Toronto area. So I've been living here for quite a long time. I've spent the last 25 years in vocational ministry, predominantly in next-gen ministry. I've been a kids pastor, a junior high pastor, been involved in youth and young adults, so kind of the whole spectrum I've done. Wow. But more recently, I've transitioned. I'm on staff at a local church. I've been here for over 12 years, more into a business pastor role. So kind of the operations side of things, but still really have a heart for next-gen ministry and really feel in this season of my life to equip emerging ministers. And so that's kind of the special project that I've been working on. I'm actually a student at ORU. I'm working on my doctorate. So brand new, just enrolled in fall of 2024. So just at the beginning of my doctoral journey, but really diving into how can we help emerging ministers be more effective, and not just effective, but longevity in ministry. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I've been focusing my research and have discovered some really cool things that I've been able to put into play here in my local context, but I think has a broader appeal as well.
Absolutely. I definitely want to dive into that because I think there's a lot we can learn from what you've studied and researched. But maybe just let me start with a personal question first. What motivated you to want to start a doctorate program? I think it's a huge undertaking. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And especially when we're talking about next-gen ministry and leadership, obviously the world is constantly evolving. So there's a lot to learn, but what made you motivated to pursue this avenue of learning, and why do you want to do that?
Yeah, great question. So a little bit of my backstory is I didn't begin my career in ministry. I actually have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. So growing up, my kind of goal in life was to go the corporate route. So I did my engineering degree. I originally moved to Toronto and began to pursue a corporate career and had, a Saul on the road to Damascus moment, sitting in my little cubicle one day, looking around at my colleagues going, is this really what I want to give my life for? And God used that moment to transition me into ministry. But I always growing up wanted to eventually do my doctorate. I didn't think it would be this late in life. But here I am today and just really felt like in this moment, in this season, that it was what I needed to do. Arthur Brooks, he's a professor at Harvard Business School. He talks about fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And fluid intelligence is that creative, innovative, new discovery intelligence that most people have in their 20s and 30s. But he says that once you hit your phase, which I'm there, you move into this crystallized intelligence phase where basically you're able to synthesize large portions of information and use it to empower and help others. And so I really felt when I hit my 40s, I moved into this stage, and kind of the doctorate is the next step for me in being able, I think, to move into what God has for me. Yeah. That's a pretty long answer to your question.
That's amazing. And honestly, working at a university myself, I am harping always with next gen leaders is how are you learning? Not when or if, but how. What is the avenue? And for you, it's a doctorate. For others, it might be a master's or finishing your undergrad degree or studying master classes. There's so many ways to learn. But I just thought it was important to kind of harp on that point of it doesn't matter where you are in your stage and your journey. We should always be learning if we want to be effective in next gen ministry. So let's talk about being effective, because you've been studying this for a while, and it may seem like a silly question and maybe a duh kind of answer, but like, why do you think effectiveness and measuring effectiveness is actually important for the next generation? Why shouldn't we just do youth ministry like we've always done it, and week in, week out retreats, and just have our flow? Why do we care about effectiveness?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting because when it comes to effectiveness, it's not something that's been defined. And so there has been tons of research done over the last 50, 60 years, and there's no one can settle on a widely accepted definition, because effectiveness is really context dependent. However, effectiveness is important. I mean, we're part of Empower 21. We're driving towards this goal of seeing everyone on planet Earth have the opportunity to hear the message of the gospel by 2033. In order to reach that, we need to be effective in that calling. So just because we can't measure it doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that we haven't found things that enable it or impact it. I think the big thing to remember is that oftentimes when we talk about effectiveness, we get hung up on numbers. Not that numbers aren't important, but numbers don't tell the whole story. Because depending on where you are in ministry, numbers may not be reflecting the impact that you're having, or even the seeds that you're sowing. And so for, next gen ministers, oftentimes when they don't see the fruit right away, they don't have the influence they think they should have. They don't have the number of kids showing up that they think they should have showing up. They become discouraged. And we need to remember that God is the Lord of the harvest. And so we're to be laborers in the field. We're to sow. And so don't allow your effectiveness to be dependent or measured by perhaps the metrics that you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we talk about effectiveness in next gen ministry, we talk about, okay, there's the numbers. So there's the quantitative, but there's also the qualitative. And I think that's always been the hard part of ministry in general. It's like, how do you measure growth and effectiveness within a youth ministry, young adult ministry? And so I think you're kind of hitting on that a little bit. What are you seeing as some of the issues when it comes to actually finding good growth? Like, how do we measure growth? What are the problems we see with that?
Well, I mean, the problem is we don't know how to measure. Like, how do you measure a young person that's being discipled?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there are steps, the water baptism and other things that may happen. But again, we don't have a good measuring stick. And I don't think we should get hung up on the measurement of effectiveness. I feel like we'll end up just kind of going in circles trying to measure it. And so I've really begun to focus on what are some of the qualities, skills, some of those things that we know impact effectiveness, as opposed to let's try and get an exact measurement. Because
absolutely,
ministry effectiveness is more of an art than a science.
That's
right?
good.
And it's hard. It's hard to measure art, right?
Yes.
It's dependent on context. And so that's really what ministry effectiveness is. It's very context dependent.
Absolutely. And I think, in some of your work, you mentioned that leadership style has a lot to do with impacting that effectiveness. What have you seen in your research and just from your experience with all of your next gen ministry experience? How does leadership style impact effectiveness in ministry?
Yeah. So leadership style is something that has been studied quite a bit when it comes to effectiveness of emerging leaders and even older leaders in a ministry context. What's interesting is when we talk about leadership styles or leadership philosophies, there seems to always be a leadership style that's in vogue. That's kind of like the go-to. Currently, we're in a bit of an authentic leadership phase. And so everyone wants to be an authentic leader. Prior to that, we had the transformational leader. Before that, we had the servant shepherd leader. And then we always also have like the authoritarian leader that we all shy away from. We're like, no, don't be that, be anything but. What's interesting is that all those four styles show that they can be effective depending on the context. So let me give you an example. We don't like to talk about the authoritarian leader, the leader that's very direct and it's, my way or the highway. However, having served in children's ministry for many years, you need to be an authoritarian leader at times in children's ministry. I took a team of children on a missions trip one time. And I mean, there was no consensus, what way should we go? What should we do today? It was like, this is what we're doing. Right. And so in next gen ministry, there are times where you need to be like, okay, this is it. I'm going to be an authoritarian leader and this is the context requires it. However, there's other times when you need to use a different style. And so what the studies have shown is that any of those leadership styles can be effective depending on the context. However, an effective minister will know what leadership style to use in the context. As you're maturing, you need to be able to flex between different leadership styles depending on the context. Now, there is one leadership style that is not effective. And so this is the one to avoid. Do not use it. And that is this laissez-faire style of leadership, which basically says no leadership at all.
Yep.
So that's the only one that is not effective. So don't use it. But the other ones, depending on your context, use them and learn to grow in recognizing what do I need to use in different situations.
Absolutely. I think that's a lot of wisdom, because I think a lot of next gen leaders, they'll say, based on their leadership style, they say, I am this. And they stick with that. And they kind of put themselves in a box, which I think also then limits their effectiveness. Like if I say, well, I'm only this kind of leader, well, then you're going to be very limited in your effectiveness, and you can stick there. But what I hear you saying is, like, when you're able to flex between these different leadership styles, and really also, I would say also, like, adding other leaders around you to also do that, that increases the effectiveness, right? Because then in every context, you can meet people where they're at, which I think is, it's awesome. How do skills play a part in that? Because obviously there's styles and personality and the way that you carry yourself, but then there's actually the hard-nosed skills of doing leadership in next gen ministry. What have you found in studying skills?
Yeah, do you know what? This was really encouraging for me, because sometimes young emerging ministers will feel like they're not going to be successful because they don't have the right context, or they weren't born in the right place. Like there's just things outside of their control. However, again, the research that's coming out is saying that there are definitely skills that are important, that impact effectiveness, but they're all things that can be developed. So it's not like you lost the lottery when it comes to being an effective minister because you weren't born with X, Y, or Z. There are skills that can be developed. And so a big one is resilience. Ability, even hard skills like administration. Sometimes, in ministry, we think, we just need to be able to talk with people and be relational. But, there's managerial skills that are needed. There's administrative skills that are needed. So all things that young emerging ministers can work on. And that's another thing that has come out, is that you need to proactively seek out, growth opportunities. And you benefit from having a coach or mentor who can provide you with honest feedback to help you grow and develop.
Yeah. And I think that hits on the larger workforce cultural questions. In the last few years, there's been quiet quitting. There's been this idea that the work-life balance, how do you find that? And I think that's impacted a lot of next-gen leaders in church spaces and ministry spaces, which personally I don't think is all bad. I think it causes us to have conversations, which I think are a good thing. But what have you seen in that way of like roadblocks or things that next-gen leaders are hitting that, kind of cause some stagnation in effectiveness, but also causes a workplace dynamic within the church and ministry world that can kind of hinder maybe the amount of effectiveness we've been having?
Yeah, two big roadblocks to effectiveness we're seeing, and one is quitting. Young ministers, young pastors, next-gen leaders quitting too soon and stunting their development. And so 4 years seems to be this sweet spot. To stick in a ministry position for a minimum of 4 years. There's something that happens. There's kind of like a hump that you get over. Robert Clinton, who was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, did great work on this leader emergence theory. And he studied hundreds of young leaders, Christian leaders, everything from biblical characters right through to historical to modern day. And in the first phase of leader development, which most people hit in their 20s, he says that God will use 4 different tests or process items to help develop your character. And so that's a faith test, it's an obedience check, it's an integrity check, and it's a word check. And he says God will use those 4 things. And I think what happens sometimes is young leaders stunt their development because they bump up against a challenge in a ministry context and they're like, I'm out of here, this is too hard. Whereas it's actually God trying to work in them, because really that first phase of ministry is more about God working in you than through you.
Wow.
It's the character development that God is trying to work in you rather than your fruitfulness. And as a young minister, if you're constantly hopping from role to role to role and not allowing God to do that hard work in you,
right,
you may see ministry effectiveness in the short term, but longevity may not be there.
Yeah.
So as
Absolutely.
someone, in my case, a lot of people that started with me in ministry aren't in ministry today. And in hindsight, looking back, I have to ask, was it because that their character wasn't formed the way it needed to be formed in order to
Mm,
sustain them for the
yeah.
longevity of ministry? And so
Wow.
quitting is definitely a big one. And then the other one is emotional well-being. And
Mm,
so the burnout, the stress, all that comes into play. However, I will say this when it comes to stress builds resilience,
mm-hmm.
and resilience is needed.
Yep.
So, as a next gen leader, your goal is not a stress free life.
Yes. Say it.
Like,
Say it
right?
again.
Your goal is not a stress free life. You need to understand that stress is required in order to build resilience. And as an older leader, helping to raise up next gen leaders, I need to remember that I don't become like the helicopter parent, that is trying to swoop in. I need to let those younger leaders under me help carry the weight of the ministry, knowing that that's going to help build resilience in them, and it builds faith.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you are in a stressful situation, when you're at the end of your rope and you see God come through in a miraculous, supernatural way,
Yep.
it does something to your faith that just hearing other people's stories can't do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I've had many conversations with students, and I'm sure you have as well, where, man, the idea of stress is very off-putting and we don't want that. And I just said, like, man, really most things in life that are worth doing will require stress. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually a requirement.
Right.
You can have stress in the gym as you're lifting weights. If there's no stress, then you're not actually doing anything. If you
Right.
don't break a sweat, you're not actually working out. In marriage, you think it's just like everything's great. There's no stress. No, there is stress, but stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. It forces you to communicate. It forces you to be vulnerable. And in the same way, like you're talking about with ministry, stress and ministry are always going to be intertwined. But what a great opportunity to have dependency on Jesus and actually say, wow, I need Jesus in this moment, or I won't make it. I won't do it.
Right.
I can't speak. I can't lead. So I just love that you hit on that in your study, because that is a hot topic, not just for next gen leaders, but for the next gen community that we serve. So it's a big deal. I think maybe just to kind of start to close it up, what would be some practical advice that you would give for next gen leaders? Because I know there's a lot that you've said there and there's a lot more we could say, but what would be your kind of advice based on your study, based on your experience? Here's what Kerri would encourage them with.
Yeah. So just to recap a couple of things, one size doesn't fit all. And so
Mm-hmm.
you do not have to lead like the way someone else leads.
Yes.
Right. And so lead the way that God created you to lead. And so lean into your unique gifting, what God has given you, because he knew where he was going to call you to be. So he has gifted you with what you need. And so definitely do that. Be proactive to grow. So you want to seek out those growth opportunities, ask for feedback, even though it may be hard to hear sometimes. But find yourself, invest in your own growth, whether you are in, an educational institution, like you're in college, university, doesn't matter. As you said, Augustine, you want to constantly be looking to grow. Stay the course. Don't give up. I think that's the big thing. There are going to be dry seasons. There's going to be hard seasons. Stay the course. God has called you. He will bring you through, and allow him to use those hard seasons to refine your character, to increase your faith, and to really grow into who he's called you to be.
Man, that's amazing. Maybe one more question, just
Okay.
for the sake of fun. What would be your personal encouragement to next gen leaders? You work with so many next gen leaders. A lot of our Empower 21 Next Gen community listens to these episodes. What would be your encouragement to them? Literally all over the world, hearing what you have to say. Yeah, what would be a word of encouragement for them?
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive. God could have chosen you to be born at any moment of time, but he chose you for this moment. I always think of the relay race analogy. You always put your best runner at the end of the race. And I believe that God has saved his best for last, and you are God's best. And so in my mind, I picture the balconies of heaven, the Peter and the Pauls and every early church member hanging over the balconies of heaven and just cheering you on as you run. So run in confidence, not in your own ability, but in the God who called you to run, and be faithful wherever he's planted you.
Amen. Amen and amen. What a way to end it. That's just powerful. Hey, I do want to just say thank you to everyone that's been listening to the episode. And I hope you have enjoyed it. You've grown, you've learned. If you would, just hit that subscribe button so we can continue to grow the community. We want to push this content out to next gen leaders that maybe aren't even in Empower 21 Next Gen yet, but they need to be. They should be. We want to encourage as many next gen leaders as we possibly can. So hit subscribe. And if you want to follow along with Kerri or anything Empower 21 Next Gen, all of that's going to be in the description below. So go to those links and you can follow along there. But Kerri, thank you so much for taking a little bit of your time today to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I hope you guys will tune in next week for our next episode. We'll see you next time on the Empower 21 Next Gen podcast.